we are both living in rural America.
Yes.
In what I call a hyper-colonized site of empire.
All right.
We are both pastors. We're both trying to do the work. And I am curious, in your context, what do you see as the work that we need to be doing?
Yeah. So I think, it's interesting you talked about like a hyper colonized context, because that's exactly how I would describe most of rural America. I specifically talk about it, obviously, like within the context of the rural South, as like an internal orient. It is an area that has been orientalized in the same way that the empire has done to the southern half of our planet and other non-dominant European countries. And so that's very resonant language, I think, for me. I think for me, the work, gosh, there's so much work, right? In rural spaces, as you know, is that we're left behind, we're abandoned, where everything's absent, in most cases. And I don't know, I'm sure you could speak to your situation. My community is a former company town from back in the day, so it's an extractive community that was built on extractive economy. And as soon as the coal was gone, the company was gone. And it just left a major wake. Just in the way that it does up and down Appalachia and elsewhere. And so in so many ways, my community is one that has been completely left behind. And so there's so much work to do and so little resources or access to the things that some people in other places are maybe slightly more privileged to at least have at their disposal. But for me, when I think about that question, I think in the broadest sense, I think about it as imagining. For me, all of our work, all the work I feel called to do goes back to helping people to imagine something different. Mm-hmm. Like, obviously there's a myriad of material needs, spiritual needs. There's a myriad of like just things that are like up against barriers within rural communities. But time and time again, the thing that I see is that our people lack an imagination necessary to dream of something bigger. And at best, we get stuck in like a cycle of nostalgia where it's just like, I wish it was like the good old days. I wish it was just, before downtown evaporated and is gone and the buildings decayed. And, when we had a high school and we had Friday night lights and we had all these things. And even then, obviously, that nostalgia is misleading because it wasn't always necessarily the good old days for everyone, right?
Yeah.
But for me, in this rural context, no matter where people are at on the political spectrum or the theological spectrum, if we can begin, I think, to help them cultivate an imagination to see something different and believe in something different, they'll work for it. They'll build it. And so for me, that's like a huge part of the work. Like we do all kinds of stuff here on the ground. But everything goes back to helping people see, like, it doesn't have to be this way. Mm-hmm. It can be different. We can construct different realities. We can build a more just and beautiful and inclusive and loving, compassionate world. And maybe we can't do it on the world scale in the way that we would like, but we can sure enough do it here. Like,
Yeah, that's what I've been saying here, that these small areas have a chance. And this local church where I'm pastoring, they have a chance to be something. And what I'm learning is they don't want to disrupt the status quo. Right. They really don't want community.
Right.
I'm told that the precondition to community is relationships. And I'm building relationships with people who want to be in honest, accountable relationship. A lot of people don't want to be in real relationship, right relationship. And I'm learning who is it that wants to build community. And who is it who wants to just maintain the status quo in institutional life, which the church is complicit in an acceleration of harm within white supremacy culture. And so I am really finding, and my therapist reminded me today, that institutions are self-interested.
Yes. Amen. No, you're right. And, this thing, something you said is like, community or solidarity requires accountability.
Right.
And we all want community until the rubber hits the road and we have to be accountable.
Right.
And because to be in real community means to prioritize responsibility over rights. It means
Right.
in the sense of like, well, I can do whatever I want. You can't, because whatever you want sometimes harms people, and
Yeah.
that causes rifts and problems. And this is something I've been thinking about, and I would love to hear what you think. I think it was I've been reading a book by philosopher Timothy Morton, and they talk about solidarity being cheap. That it's literally one of the most abundant resources as far as like our like ontological reality, because we are interdependent creatures. We come into the world in interdependence, and we have set up the system to work to rob us of that, to make us think we are not that. And so they kind of formulate solidarity and community as really like the most basic fundamental thing about our world, not just between humans, but humans and plant life and animal life and non-living organisms. I love that notion that solidarity is abundant, but we have come to a place where we have eschewed it because we don't want to be responsible, even though it is our.
Yes. I just had this conversation with a church member that this church member said people actually don't want accountability.
Right.
And this woman said that the church where I'm pastoring is doing the same thing as the Trump presidency, choosing the institution over community.
Yeah.
And I feel like institutions, churches, organizations do this all the time to preserve whatever they have, which I think could be an expression of hoarding wealth and hoarding property and wrapped up in white supremacy culture.
Oh, you're getting it. Oh, this is exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking about, like I'm a redneck, and I live amongst rednecks, and I wear that as a badge of honor. I think it's become to mean a lot of things that I don't think it means. But there is like this culture of like, when I think about when you were talking about that, I was thinking about preservation. I was thinking about like prepping culture, like how there's like actually a good impulse about being ready to live in a world falling apart, right? But a lot of like the prepping culture, or like the so-called redneck impulse, is about accumulation and like me and my four and no more. And so like it's about self-preservation. And so like that line that you said that your churches are doing the same thing as the Trump administration, like that's just spot on, because it's about it's self-preservation and about accumulation. And when I think about what we have, what the potential, what we have is, it's not accumulation, it's abundance. We have the opportunity for abundance, but we are so caught up in trying to preserve ourselves or our institutions that we can't. And we prioritize that. And gosh, no, that's good. And I think that's spot on. And I think that's the hardest part for like institutionalized, with Christianity, like, particularly, and then of course other traditions, I'm sure, but it's like we get so caught up in the thing, like worried about preserving the thing, that we lose it. I think, I think even theologically, right? We argue about the sacraments. We have been arguing about the sacraments pretty much endlessly since, the beginning. And we forget that the sacraments, are like the bread and wine, are meant to move us into a different reality, to help us experience something. But we're so focused on the details, right? And so the same thing happens on the institutional level. We have to keep this thing alive. But gosh, that's not the gospel. The gospel is giving ourselves away in love, in this kenotic, like self-giving love, because it is a multiplying giving away. It is when we give ourselves over. And to me, that's, I work a lot, and I know you use this language too around compost. It's a language that's very like caught up in my vocational work and my academic work as well. Is like compost is a taking the old and the new and putting it together and turning it over in love and kindness and with faithfulness, so that something new can emerge. And you just can't do that if you're just got your heels in the ground saying it's got to be the way that it's been for 40 years. And we got to make sure there's this much in our endowment, so 10 people can keep showing up on Sunday for the next 20 years until all of us are gone, and then we can sell the church off or something or whatever,
I think that's where this church is. They've given me 6 more months. And the trustees want to fire me. The elders want to keep me. And I brought 12 new members in who are ready to support the work. And this is a congregation of, like, we're 25 or 30 on a good day.
Mm-hmm.
And brought 12 people in, and they're ready to commit to the work of building solidarity and community through technologies of food and gathering.
Mm.
They are not here for religion. They've been reading my Substack, and now they're attending church. And now the church says you have 6 months, and we want you to essentially only build relationships with the members.
Mm. Gosh, that's so counterintuitive to what they actually probably want, or at least they say they want.
Right? Yeah, they hired me.
You want to.
Right, they hired me to take the church to the future. So I've got 12 new members who are ready to fund the work of community organizing and community building to take this church to the future. Great ideas these people have, concrete ideas. And so if the organizing stops, I fear that the trustees and church leadership are going to strangle this church. And what are they going to do in 6 months when my contract is over? No one wants to be here. The other person who was a candidate for this position said the church was dead. And it's true. The former pastor did not reach out to the community. I'm told that I'm the only minister who has engaged the community in the 40 plus years that they've had a minister.
And that's a bad thing, apparently.
That's a bad thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is, I'm sure, a mainline congregation of some sort.
So it's an independent church.
Oh, okay.
Supported by its members. And, it's a very antiquated model of only using church membership to fund the church. We know statistics that churches who pivot toward community succeed, and those who close the doors don't.
Right.
And so I am a public theologian, and I build community wherever I am. So we're going to continue to build community. Our work will be supported through community. Right. And I guess the church will figure out what it wants to do.
I think, and this is not nothing I'm sure you don't know, but it makes me think a lot of ways when I think about the church and the institution in the way that it is. I think about, and this is a rough reading of the story, but in the Hebrew canon, the story of, Jonathan and Caleb going into the promise, going into Canaan, and they come back and they're telling about it being a land of milk and honey. But a lot of the other people that go with them, they come back and they're like, it's full of giants. It's like scary. It's all these things. And the people of Israel in the story, like they harden and they're like afraid to go. So that's when they start this 40-year journey of just wandering. And I think a lot about like Jonathan and Caleb. I think about them having to. I don't know if I said Jonathan and Caleb. Sorry, my bad. Joshua and Caleb. I think about them having to walk around for 40 years until that previous generation passed on before they could step foot into the promised land. And I think a lot of ways how, when I think about the church, is like there are just certain situations and institutions. And it sounds that might sound a little grotesque, or it might even sound a little maybe unkind, but to some extent, I think the church as a whole, we're facing a situation where there are some people who have planted really good seeds in the soul of people like you and me and others who they just can't eat the fruit from those trees.
Right.
They'll never be able to do it. And that's not a judgment. It's just a reality of like there's a barrier there. And, and I hope that same thing. I think about my children. Like I hope that the fruit they bear in their lives far exceeds something I could ever have imagined. And it goes to places, it carries some places and does things that I could have never imagined myself doing, or pushing the boundaries of love and grace and mercy in the world. And so like when I think about the institutional church, there is a level of which where, things, this is the thing. We talk a lot. Sorry, I know I'm kind of mixing metaphors here and stuff, but like we talk a lot about death and resurrection and it being the way of Christianity and the faith and all these things. But the thing is like Jesus didn't just resurrect out of nowhere, right?
Right.
Like Jesus gave his life over and then, this vindication, this resurrection power happens. In the same way, compost doesn't just happen, right? It's a process of working it. You have to work compost. You have to put things in it. You have to turn it over. You have to tend to it with love and care. And that's not to say that things in nature don't decay and give life to the soul on their own. But like composting is it is a work. It is something you are putting intention into. And to me, resurrection is the same thing. It's not something that just happens haphazardly. It's something we put intention into. And so I think sometimes we're quick to say, well, we just got to let the church die and then it'll be resurrected. But sometimes, things die and they don't give life to something else. There is a death that doesn't give life, but there is a death that leads to resurrection. And that comes by being willing to compost these institutional structures. And sometimes the institution is not ready for it. Yeah. And might not ever be ready for it.
Well, I don't think they're ready. I don't think this church is ready. And, what gets me is I know of one church member who prayed for an activist pastor, prayed that someone would come and do something. So I'm doing something, and it's upsetting the status quo, and people who are used to being in power don't feel like they're in power, and people who are in power probably shouldn't be in power, and there's no imagination, and this church is going to die probably. Just like so many other churches are dying. Yeah. So a church member said to me, if this village cannot keep a church going, this is a losing village.
And what you think about this experience is like, it kind of sounds like, this church is pretty insular, and that's a whole other level when you're in a rural context, right? Because your context already, your village is already insular. It's already cut off. It's already kind of in this place, disconnected. And so then to have a group within that already kind of isolated area further, become more insular is just like, instead we should be turning ourselves out,
and I think people are, people are reading my Substack, and that's growing, and people are leaving too. It's clarifying. I asked one church member, saw that you unsubscribed from my Substack. Why'd you do that? He said, I was just cleaning up my email. And I was like, oh, well, why'd you subscribe in the first place? I'm curious. Why are people subscribing to my Substack? Well, apparently that was the wrong question to ask. It pissed him off, I think. And then I got talked about it by the chair of the board of elders. And, and I'm like, wow, people do not know how to be in conversation here, or just respond to really legitimate questions. Are you just lurking? Are you there for the spectacle, or are you there for the work?
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of that are there for the spectacle, right? They just want to keep tabs, right? I imagine.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that we got a chance to talk. I've been, reading your stuff, and I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to connect when I was in Nashville, but hopefully we can continue a conversation about composting and how do we really do the work of composting for another possible world.
Amen. Yeah. I think, I would love that. And I think, gosh, this is like, there's just so many challenges, right? I think about shift gears, if it's okay, just a minute to my context a bit. We don't have like a standard church. We don't, all of our work is primarily community organizing, and I'm being ordained in the Disciples of Christ tradition next month, finally. Stoked. I'm not sure they know what to do with me, and I don't know what to do with them either. So it's like a really good relationship. So we're kind of just in it together and recognize the need and community and call and vocation. And there's a mutuality to it of this is, interesting. And, but, here, we're dealing with a lot of, most of the churches here are evangelical. And so we're dealing primarily with people who are not necessarily interested in church at all, or are interested in, somewhat bringing a lot of baggage, particularly. I'm sure there's plenty up there too, but in the South.
Yeah, it's the same here. And the people who want to build are people who want community, not church. They don't want religion. Right. They want community.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's exactly like, where we go. And oftentimes we get asked, well, is it a church? It's not. I'm like, it's a lot of things depending on who you ask. And there's people who have no interest in that kind of conversation at all. And there's people who have a lot of interest in those kind of conversations. But at the end of the day, all of our work is about helping build something different.
Yeah.
And it takes all kinds of people and perspectives and theological perspectives even, but the ground is fertile for it. And I think in these
Yeah.
rural contexts, despite I know like you're facing this challenge with your church, but like really there's something really fertile about rural places for this kind of work of community.
Yes. Yes.
God, but it
I
doesn't make
see
it
it.
any less hard.
I see possibility here, and it's not only frustrating but gut wrenching to see a church hold on so tightly to the thing that they miss the spirit.
Right.
I mean, and this I think is part of the sin of white Christian supremacy.
Yeah.
That they miss the spirit.
Yeah, we get so caught up in the form and function that we miss what God's doing.
Right.
I think I had a friend one time tell me like Christians will spend 1,000 years arguing about what God's hands look like instead of like figuring out where it's pointing them towards.
Right.
Like who it's pointing them towards, and that's the perennial problem with churches that have been primarily formed by empire and colonization, and it is a static, rigid system, and I'm thankfully I came up in the Pentecostal tradition, still obviously problematic oftentimes when it comes to like the racial issues in the South, but in a tradition rooted in non-white a non-white expression of Christianity. Right. And one that had an emphasis that the Spirit does what she wills. And if you'll just open yourself up to it, you'll no telling where she will carry you and at what she'll ask of you. And that's the other thing. And that's what, what you're saying about being closed off to the Spirit or not seeing it. It's because the Spirit asks us things that we don't want to hear. The Spirit asks us to do things and leads us to places we don't want to go. Because we don't want to be accountable, because we don't want to give up power, because we don't want to say like there might be something different if we in this letting go, in this surrender, and to me that's where it comes back to is are we willing to go contexts, that are primarily white, mainline, or evangelical kind of former, even the progressive spaces, they fall into that same trap of like a static, kind of rigid model. So,
yeah,